Hello, everyone. It is me, Known Wells, creator and host of You, Me, Empathy. Today, in episode 8, I chat with my friend Tony for a Tony Time installment on depression. We're going to dig deeper into depression on this episode, talk about when a patient comes to Tony and they say, I think I'm depressed. What are Tony's responses? How does he handle that? We explore that together and how he treats depression in his patients, the common misconceptions of depression, and the difference between sadness and depression, and a whole lot more. The disclaimer for the show is that You, Me, Empathy is for informational and or entertainment purposes only, and is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And as it pertains to my buddy Tony, or Anthony Romanke, he is a California licensed marriage and family therapist, licensed by the Board of Behavioral Sciences, license number LMFT 47805. Okie dokie, that's it, artichokies. No, actually, one more thing. Go check out our new Patreon page. It's patreon.com/YouMeEmpathy, and it's a place where you can support the show on an ongoing basis. Isn't that fun? For 25 cents, a mere 25 cents per episode, you can support the show. And if you wanted to throw a little bit more my way, you can get stickers. You can even be a guest on the show. A lot of fun. Go to patreon.com/YouMeEmpathy. Okay, guys. Thanks so much for listening and enjoy episode 8. Welcome to episode 8 of You, Me, Empathy. I am here, as I always am, on these Tony Time episodes with my friend and psychotherapist, Tony. Hello, Tony.
Hello, Known.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well.
Nice.
I can't believe we're already at episode 8. It seems like it's sort of flown by this podcast, and it's keeping me busy.
Yeah, you've been doing a lot of work. I mean,
a weekly show is different than a bi-weekly show, which is what I did with Joy Sandwich.
Yeah.
This show, takes a lot more work and on a variety of levels, and I think that's a good thing, and I enjoy it. I'm enjoying the process.
Well, good, because hopefully that's half of what we're doing here, right? Is
yes.
something to be enjoyed.
Yes, indeed. So on today's show, we are going to talk about depression. So I had, if you listen to episode 7, I had a conversation with Eric Zimmer of the podcast, The One You Feed. Go check that out. It's a great podcast. He spoke about his experience with depression. And today's episode, for the Tony Time version of depression, I'm going to ask Tony some questions. We're going to talk about how he handles depression from his point of view as a therapist with his patients. So the first thing, one of the sort of things I've been thinking about in regards to depression is how big it is.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that Eric and I were talking about, how sort of big the concept is. And I mean that on a number of levels. I mean that in it's sort of hard. It's big in terms of it's hard to sort of wrap your brain around. It's also big in terms of like millions of people suffering from depression, diagnosed with depression. I think where I want to start is, how do you, as a therapist, how do you, let's say a patient comes to you and says, how do I know if I'm depressed?
Right. Which quite often happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, very common, for somebody to come in, or maybe they say something to the effect of, I think I might be depressed,
Yeah.
but, might.
Right.
I'm not sure, but I'm thinking I could be. And, one of the wonderful tools as clinicians that we have is something called the Diagnostical Statistical Manual that's created by the American Psychiatric Association. And, within that beautiful, large book that we have that's filled with diagnoses, we have a set of criteria that we get to go through and evaluate a client from. Mm-hmm. And there's other tools that we can use. There's the Beck Depression Inventory, and certainly we use our clinical interview skills to help facilitate an assessment. But, one thing Eric had mentioned that I really appreciated in his interview with you was this concept of looking at depression as a basically what I heard from him was it's a cluster of symptoms.
Right.
And we've created, or the American Psychiatric Association has created, if you have these symptoms, we're going to give this particular thing a name.
Sure.
And this particular cluster of symptoms we're going to call depression. But one of the things I felt like I heard Eric and you talk about in your podcast was this idea of, regardless of this cluster of symptoms that we're identifying with, it's still kind of different for everybody.
Right. Right.
And, and so when somebody comes into me and again kind of drops, hey, I think I might be depressed, I don't automatically just say, well, okay, so let's, evaluate you based on this, and then just put them in this kind of cookie cutter, kind of concept of what I think depression is, and we, just work from a cookie cutter, kind of point of view. Although there are some standard treatments for depression that are very effective, there's still, I think, a unique aspect to everybody's presentation that you really got to spend some time to get to know, because, in spite of the fact that there may be some commonalities of symptoms that are presented, I still think everybody's a very unique person, and what might be behind their depression, I think you really have to investigate.
One of the things that I've been thinking about is so before that episode with Eric, you shared with me Dr. Alex Korb's sort of research a little bit on neuroscience and the brain and depression. And one of the things that he mentioned and sort of opened my eyes a little bit is the common sort of confusion between depression and sadness.
Right.
And the big sort of distinguishing mark of depression, which doesn't usually occur in sadness, and correct me if I'm wrong,
sure,
is a feeling of emptiness.
Correct.
Right? So I could be sad that, Eric said, in the episode, he had a dog die.
Yeah.
He was very sad by this, and it's a very saddening event. When Scooby goes, I'm going to be a fucking mess.
Right.
Sad, and probably sad for a long time. But the difference between that experience and depression is, with depression, I'm empty. I don't feel anything. I don't want to do anything. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. Yeah. And we do, again, clinically, if somebody comes in, I'm trying to separate that out to really get a feel for what the person is truly going through. And and that's correct. I mean, sadness is a very common human emotion, but depression and that emptiness that you talk about is a kind of a key defining factor, because what somebody, who's really going through a depression, or, what we would call a clinical depression, is actually coming in and they're reporting that, everything feels pointless.
Right.
There's just a general hopelessness and a pointlessness, and they don't see a reason to, they don't see generally a reason to get out of bed. They don't feel a reason, life seems pointless, kind of that existential crisis that you two kind of touched on a little bit in the podcast. And so therefore there's an emptiness, there's nothing has meaning, nothing has value, nothing has significance or important. There's no motivation, the person's completely lacking any real motivation. Why try? What's the point? There's nothing inside of me that's making me want to do anything, and generally, what we look for is is the person no longer experiencing joy in the thing they used to experience joy from?
Right.
And has that gone? Or is there no more meaning for the person in their life any longer? And so, these are kind of, those big separating, differentiating differences between somebody who just might be sad, who may have gone through something, a loss, and we're always looking for that. We're always trying to determine whether, is bereavement a part of this? Has the person lost something? Is this more of kind of what we would consider an adjustment disorder, which is an actual diagnosis, meaning is the person going through something situationally difficult that they're trying to adjust to, and it's creating symptoms within them, but it's due to a particular type of stressor, something, it's a divorce, it's a breakup, it's a loss of a job. Now, if that's prolonged, that can turn into a clinical depression. But if it's kind of within a normal time frame, so to speak, of an adjustment period, then, we also look at that as maybe temporary, compared to something that might, be different than that and look more depressive in nature.
So you deal with this a lot. What are the sort of percentages? Like, how often is it just a sort of a temporary period of darkness and sadness versus an actual like clinical depression?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I'm not sure I've really even ever tried to break that down, but I see quite a bit of people that are coming in with some form of adjustment disorder, where they're coming in, something has happened, a breakup of a relationship, again, a divorce, loss of a job. And there is this kind of temporary manifestation of symptoms as a result of that particular stressor. Mm-hmm. That's a fairly common presenting issue, I think, in most clinical practices. And then I would say, maybe almost as equal. So maybe they're almost equal to one another in percentages. I would say are the people who are presenting with a depressive disorder where they might actually qualify for some type of actual clinical diagnosis. And, there's a couple different types of, disorders that clinical depressive disorders somebody could present with. I mean, you have your major depressive disorder, which is the one that we tend to think about, that's your clinical depression. But we also have one called a persistent depressive disorder. We used to call it dysthymia and dysthymic disorder. And that's when somebody is presenting with more of like a long-term, low-grade chronic depression. And they're, how they've manifested in somebody's life is quite different. One, again, tends to be very persistent and chronic, a little bit more low grade. And a major depressive disorder, we can look for potentially diagnosing that in somebody who's had, criteria or the meeting of criteria that's lasted maybe only 2 weeks. So they're very, different in that way. So, and I tend to see a fair amount of people who actually present with, a chronic depression quite a bit as well, significantly.
Yeah. I think that's what I deal with. I've never been diagnosed, by a professional with depression. I mean, my therapist is, I guess a psychologist. Is it a psychologist or would a psychiatrist? Psychologist.
Well, you could psychologist, counselor, marriage family therapist can diagnose, psychiatrist, certainly. Yeah,
a therapist has mentioned it. I think I go through spouts where it's sort of, a month or so I'm feeling kind of like hopeless.
Right.
When you are having these conversations with your patients, what kinds of fact-finding missions are you going on with them? Like what kinds of questions are you asking them to decipher whether or not they are depressed?
Sure. It's kind of a mix. I think there's a lot of questions that I'm asking that are very criteria based, so as I'm, doing an initial assessment, as I'm going through the, initial interview process with a client, and depending on what they've kind of presented with in terms of what they've, basically shared with me, is there what we call kind of the presenting issue, why are you here today? Basically, what brought you in to therapy? And people are, generally have come in with, one or two or maybe three even things that they're presenting with. And, so usually, your ears are kind of picking up right away in terms of what they're presenting with that kind of is starting to guide your questions. And of course, you start with the larger questions and you kind of work your way down into more narrow, more specific type of questions as that interview process continues, which can take a few sessions, really. I mean, as you're getting to know a client, getting to know their history. And, and I think you want to be very thorough. I mean, I think, I think it's very important to get as best as possible to get an accurate diagnosis, because that's really going to inform your treatment, and that's really going to determine how are you going to help this particular client. So the more information that I have, and the more I know about a particular client, it just better informs me of how we're going to work and what the treatment's going to look like. So I guess I start kind of larger on the questions, and I'm looking for, again, what brought you in today. I'm looking for what symptoms have you been experiencing, recently, but also historically. I'm certainly extremely interested in family history. I mean,
right.
That's going to be a huge area of conversation and exploration, is to find out the person's history, because again, you and Eric touched on this, but if there's a family history of something, if I'm hearing that there's a strong family link to depression or anxiety or any other form of mental illness, I'm going to really stand out for me, and inform further questions about this particular client and in my investigation. So that's going to be huge.
Because being around that affects you, right?
Well, I think you're looking for a couple things. I think, one, you're trying to understand your client from a social perspective. And, what was the type of relational social environment in which they grew up in? What were they exposed to? And, I'm a huge fan of, lack of a better term, neuroscience and the understanding of how our brains develop, as kind of a result of our social experiences, our relational experiences. So that's going to be a huge important understanding for me, is what were the social contexts of the person's upbringing and family history. But also what you're looking for is, do we have some genetic links? What may have been passed down to this person genetically? What might they be predisposed to? As well as there's this whole new field of epigenetics and what is happening with a person with regards to gene expression and what is somebody's social environment potentially turn on in them from a genetic perspective that may, predicate the onset of something like this. So it's, we're gonna look a lot. We're gonna look at medications. We're gonna look at what medications are they currently taking.
Yeah.
We're certainly gonna look at a medical history. What's the person? If somebody's presenting to me and they've not checked any of this out with a medical professional, if they've not actually gone and done a physical with their medical physician, if they've not ruled out the potential for some type of actual, physiological or biological cause for what's happening.
What would those be, like, as an example?
One of the first things that kind of pops into my mind is if the person might potentially be dealing with a thyroid problem.
Sure.
There can be a lot of crossovers. There can be a lot of similarities to somebody who may present with depression, because you're going to look at things like fatigue. You're going to look at things as low energy. You're going to look at just maybe some just general apathy. And so, so we definitely want to make sure that we're ruling out first that there isn't, another, cause to what the person's presenting to. So, my recommendations, if they haven't, is always to go get a checked out by their physician first before we look at something from a, relational, emotional point of view. So
that makes sense, because that's, one of the things we as humans tend to forget about is, or we ignore, is that just the mind body, right?
Right.
And they're so intricately connected and affect one another, and it can become a sort of cyclical nightmare of sorts.
Yeah. Absolutely.
What are some of the misconceptions about depression? Obviously we talked about a little bit about, equating sadness to depression and mixing those two up. But what are maybe some other ones can you speak to?
Well, if this is kind of in line maybe with what you're asking, but the first thought that I had was, even listening to you and Eric talk about it on the podcast, one of the things I thought I heard, which is just, I think it's how we talk about it, is when we say that maybe we're down, our mood's down or I'm blue.
Yeah.
That we tend to say, I'm depressed,
Yeah.
Man, I'm just...
Our language.
The
Yeah.
languaging of this. I'm so depressed. And, again, for me as a clinician, that depression means something, and I think of it clinically. But I think what most people talk about are what we would consider, subclinical symptoms of depression.
Mm-hmm.
And subclinical meaning, you wouldn't qualify for a diagnosis of depression, but you're certainly maybe sad.
Yeah.
Like going back to that concept. Or maybe you've just had a couple bad days and maybe you don't even know why. Maybe your mood is just really low. You're feeling kind of blue. Maybe you're not really necessarily aware of why, or there's not necessarily a very obvious trigger for why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. But I think people language it as, oh man, I'm so depressed.
And I get that. I think I've done that myself.
I think we all have. Yeah,
it's a catch-all term.
Sure.
It's become it is, as I mentioned at the top, it's such a big thing, and using that term is a good catch-all term, but it as Tony's pointing out, it's problematic, right?
Well, it's confusing, right?
Yeah.
It can be confusing because I think we throw around the term very loosely now because it's a part of our pop culture terminology.
I think of the scene in The Goonies where I think Chunk says, "I'm depressed," and he's squirting the whipped cream in his mouth. Delightful. Right. But,
it's a great scene, by the way. Yeah.
A great scene. And, that movie came out in the 80s, so clearly like this language thing has been around for a while. So what can we do? Like, obviously one thing we can do is learn more, discover the difference between sadness and depression and really understand maybe a little bit better what depression is. Sure. And then use our words, use our language, and just try to be a bit more precise about the language.
Yeah. And I think too, as you were sharing that, the thought that popped into my head was, when do we start to wonder for ourselves, is this something I need to be concerned about?
Sure.
When is this something that's no longer, I'm depressed, kind of like the way that we're talking about it right now, just kind of like, I'm just kind of bummed. I've had kind of a couple bad days versus I think I might be depressed.
Yeah.
And I think I might need to go see somebody. And, one of the thoughts that I had about that was, gosh, if I were somebody and I was trying to, really think about that, I think one of the big differences is impact or impairment to life. And most of the diagnoses that we use and are in the DSM really focus on that as criteria, is that, that whatever it is I'm probably going through, symptom wise in terms of a cluster of symptoms, is there impairment in my functioning? Is this somehow restricting my life? Is this preventing me from, being more fully present in a relationship? Is this preventing me from being more, able to work? Is this preventing me from getting things done that actually need to be getting done? If your depression or, your evaluation of your symptoms and you're thinking, I can't pay my bills. Like I literally cannot work up the energy and the motivation to sit down and pay my bills. I just don't have it, or I can't get out of bed to get to work. And therefore I may lose my job, or, my wife has pulled away, significantly because I'm just not participating in our relationship because I just am so down. I can't seem to, pull myself out. These would probably be some real urgent, type of issues to look at, and somebody would probably want to seek some help. Other thing, certainly right on target with this too, is if somebody's having suicidal or homicidal thoughts, we call ideation. If somebody's having ideation of any form of either suicidal or homicidal ideation, you absolutely want to seek help right away. I mean, that is absolutely a high priority to seek out treatment.
So when you say ideation, what does that mean exactly?
So, if you're having thoughts of, and when we think of suicidal ideation, we think of there's a little bit more on the passive side, which is you hear people talk about, which is, I just don't think I want to live.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I got hit by a car today, that'd be great.
Sure.
Or if a plane fell out of the sky and landed on me, wonderful. And that's, a little bit maybe more on the passive side, although still extremely concerning. I mean, very, very concerning. And I'd really encourage somebody to seek help versus, somebody who's more, has moved beyond passive ideation into some form of active ideation where it's, I'm thinking about how to kill myself.
Okay.
I'm actually thinking about, I have pills in the house. I could take those. Or this is how I would do it. If somebody's thinking, that's an extreme sign that somebody probably needs to go seek out mental health, a professional, or go to your local emergency room right away.
Right.
That is an absolute urgent issue that needs to be, seek treatment immediately. So,
good point. Two anecdotes, personal.
Sure.
On the sort of passive side, I think I do sometimes have a cavalier flair with putting, not sort of worrying about putting my body in danger. Like,
what do you mean?
What I mean by that is, okay, I can couch this in the context of my relationship with Jessica.
Yeah.
For example, I got a mountain bike recently, and
I know, I'm so excited. Shall we tell the listeners we went out on Sunday?
Yeah.
I had a great time.
Great time.
Yeah.
Tony, also a therapist, but he's a mountain bike expert as well.
I do enjoy. Well, not sure expert.
Just shredding those trails.
Hey, if our listeners could only see you climb those hills, he's like a mountain goat, people. Let me tell you.
No, so when I have this flair with, back in my mind, I'm feeling like, okay, like I'm willing to take more risk, I think, with like my body. And I don't have, like, I'm not too worried if I'm going to get hurt. You had mentioned it's just a matter of time, right?
It's not, right. It's not if you're going to fall, it's when you're going to fall.
Exactly. And so sometimes I have that in a lot of areas of my life where I feel like it's probably going to happen anyways if I am more cautious or worried about stuff, and like, then it's just going to affect my experience in the now, right? So
sure,
that's probably a very light version of what you're talking about, but I do I'm thinking like, oh, I don't care if I get hurt. Like what it's going to happen. Like, so I have I think a little cavalier attitude about it sometimes. And it bothers Jessica.
I was going to say, does it bother you or Jessica?
It bothers Jessica. And sometimes I wonder if I do it just to sort of get her going a little bit, but that's just, I don't know. That's an anecdote. The other one is more serious in that when I was studying abroad in Wales, and I was going through a very deep, dark depression period of my life and dealing with the eating disorder and really being exceptionally isolated. I was away from everyone I knew in another country. And, 118 pounds. I was, I was a mess. Everything hurt physically and mentally. And I had suicidal ideation. I had vivid memories. I would take these long baths. And I had this thought that as I sat in the bath, the water sort of, blurred my figure, which I grew to hate because it was so just gross and skeletal, And I had thoughts about killing myself in the bathtub and thinking about like what my blood would look like on the porcelain white tub, and I had those thoughts and would write them down and stuff. And so I just wanted to bring that personal experience because I've gone through that, and it was scary. It was scary, but in retrospect, it's scarier. Like at the time, I feel like, oh, this is the direction that it's going, and this makes sense, right?
Well, maybe what you're touching on there, and maybe what this is making me think of that I, was thinking like, boy, our listeners, this might be something for us to punctuate a little bit was that point of how it's maybe so easy for us at those points to almost minimize or normalize the severity of something, like that we're going through.
Sure.
And it's not until we maybe look back on it with a healthier perspective, maybe we've gotten the treatment and we look back and realize now that was scary. Like you said, like that was scary. Like I was in a bad place.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be thinking those things.
Right.
I mean, that's not in a sense, that's not the signs of mental health, right? If I'm, if this is the, again, what I would imagine for you, just from, your sharing our conversations was, you slipped into that place, kind of step by step by step. It's not like you take a big leap.
Right.
From, also mental health to mental illness, it's this very subtle, slow type of process. And I think as we so slowly move into something like that, it just becomes normal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's almost something just so normal about where we find ourselves.
It's comforting too. It becomes a comfort,
Yeah, maybe a familiarity too.
Just because, what you know.
What you know. I mean, there's like a familiarity. And, so as you were sharing that with me, running through my mind was this idea of like, it's so easy for us to slip into this thing of, well, I'm not so bad yet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is acceptable.
Yeah.
As opposed to realizing, no, this is not. That this is not okay, and I actually really need to do something about this. I need to talk to somebody. I need to reach out. I need to get mental health. I need to seek out a mental health professional and someone to help with this because again, like that's not okay. That's certainly not being in an okay place, and it's certainly not indicative of mental health. And being in a good healthy place, but how easy it is to feel normal.
It is easy. Yeah, it is easy because, as you said, it just becomes what you know and it becomes your world. And it's easy to get used to that.
Right.
If you're, especially if you're isolated.
Sure.
I think a key is having people around you who, see you for who you are.
Yeah.
And care about you and have a sort of understanding of mental illness and,
sure.
and are the people that are going to sort of get you, help you, guide you to a healthier place.
Well, and on that note too, I was thinking that what I think can become so difficult if somebody's dealing with depression is the feeling that nobody cares.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I'm not worth caring about.
Yeah.
And these real feelings of hopelessness. And one of the things I recognize in that, in working with people clinically is, we can become very distorted in our thinking, and which can certainly lead to some of these issues that we're talking about related to clinical depression. In fact, one of the most effective treatments for clinical depression is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is helping people capture their distortions of thought and their misinterpretations and reworking, the way we perceive, relationships, the way we perceive information, the way that we look at ourselves, the way that we maybe look at our future, and beginning to help somebody think differently. Again, Alex Korb's book, The Upward Spiral, is a fantastic book. He studied at UCLA, spent, his research in neuroscience with depression. So a great book, highly recommend it. But really helping people to look at things differently around them. But if they're, I call filters, if their templates are looking at things in this way, and therefore their feeling, our cognitions have a huge impact on our feelings. If our feelings now are that, people don't care because that's how we're interpreting and experiencing those relationships around us, I mean, it can be horrifying, the impact that has on us in terms of how we see, whether, how do we get out of this, basically? How do we move forward?
How do you? I mean, so when you're treating your patients with who have depression, what are the things that you prescribe for them to do to help combat the depression?
Sure. As I mentioned, cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the evidence-based treatments that we use in psychotherapy for the treatment of depression. Mm-hmm. The other is, as I mentioned before, is having somebody go get medically checked out by their physician to make sure that there's not something from a medical biophysiological place that's happening that's actually creating the depression.
Yeah.
So that's key. That's going to be first. Another recommendation is probably going to be to a psychiatrist, so they can also be evaluated by a psychiatrist, and we can determine whether they're a good candidate for antidepressant medication. Mm-hmm. So it's usually a combination of antidepressants and psychotherapy, talk therapy, and those are generally going to be the two main interventions that we're going to use to treat somebody's depression. In addition to that, again, as I'm getting to know somebody, working with them, and really knowing their history, there's the potential that other types of psychotherapy treatment modalities might be used depending on the particular client and their presentation and their needs, basically, from psychotherapy. So as we get into some of the deeper issues, there are certainly other things that they could potentially benefit from, looking at things from an interpersonal neurobiology point of view, attachment theory, and understanding, maybe even some theoretical work from a psychodynamic perspective. But cognitive behavioral therapy really right now is the most evidence-based treatment for people with depression. And again, and then the psychopharmaceutical intervention.
Mm-hmm. What are Alex Korb mentions gratitude, sort of like having this gratitude journal and writing in it every day, just the stuff in your world that you're thankful for. Yep. That's a thing that you can do on your own. What are other types of things that you can do on your own that would, maybe help your journey in depression?
You guys touched on this, you and Eric.
Yeah.
And I loved what Eric had said about he has an appreciation journal.
Yeah.
And I love that. I was, I'm going to steal that from you, Eric, if you're listening. I really like that. I thought that was a really, really great exercise. And the point to that, very much in line with cognitive therapy. And I also like what Eric was talking about. This isn't a positive psychology tool.
Sure.
And as you had mentioned, which I also appreciated, this isn't dismissing what you're feeling. This isn't minimizing maybe the hurt or the pain or the emotions that you're going through. It's not that at all. It's just training the brain, being intentional and mindful, as the two of you talked about as well. I love mindfulness. That's absolutely something that I think is a huge healthy treatment intervention for somebody that's dealing with this particular issue. In addition to others, I think mindfulness is just a wonderful tool in general. And so the intentionality, the training of the brain to, recognize the things that you're, from Eric's perspective, appreciating, from the things that you're finding fulfillment in. And there's intentionality is the word there for me. It's an intentional focus to reflect back on the day, think about the things that you appreciated, because for me, that is such a wonderful tool that each one of us has. And I think one of the major benefits from that is what a great tool for self-awareness and learning about ourselves. Because I think, we can fly through each day, pay very little attention to anything that happened, and just survive it somehow and get through and just go to bed and just wake up and do it all over again. But I think there's something to be said about the intentionality of stopping, reflecting back on the day, recognizing where was I fulfilled? Mm-hmm. What were my joys of the day? What were my pains? What were the things that maybe were not as also as wonderful? Because I think what that informs us is, what do we want to do more of?
Yeah.
And I'm always asking clients that when a client comes in and says, I had a great week or I experienced far less of this symptom, what I'm always asking is, well, what did you do different?
Mm-hmm.
Or what was different about that day? What did you do different? What was your different experience? But quite often, what did you do? What was different? And once we kind of discover whatever that particular thing was, I'm always wondering or asking and exploring, well, how do we do more of that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how do we bring more of that into your life? Because that sounded like that had a positive impact on you. Sounds like that was very beneficial. Sounds like it really helped you reduce your symptoms. So great. How do we bring more of that into your life? And if we're reflective, mindful, I think we can find those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to sort of start to wrap this up. Listeners, everything that Tony just said in the last couple of minutes, take that into your hearts, into your minds. I think that so much of mental health is we get so isolated, we feel so isolated, and we get, as we're talking about, this one-track mind. And if we can, it takes effort. It takes work.
Absolutely.
That takes work. But think about what Tony just said and the potential for impact on your life and the potential for bringing in more graciousness and joy and, understanding what is a pain for you and understanding what is a joy for you. Having that, working on that sort of insight into your own sort of reaction to things and emotions is such a great, it's something that I try to work on all the time. I struggle with sometimes, but I know that the impact on the back end is so worth it to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, I tell clients when they come in and sometimes people come in the worst states of hopelessness, and one of the things I share with them authentically, that I get to share with them, and I'm always so privileged to be able to share with them is I really know, we can work on this, and I really know, I have hope, because I've being the, therapist, I have the privilege of, now having, so many, gosh knows how many hours of working with clients. And so I've had the privilege of seeing those changes take place, and I've seen people get better. So I have the wonderful benefit of sitting across from somebody, and while they're hopeless, I'm hopeful.
That warms my heart.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I mean, it's one of the most amazing things for me to sit across from somebody in their despair, and to sit with authentic hope, to know that this is temporary. And we can get through this, and I know there's something so much better waiting for this person once we've started this work, and that's a great thing. I mean, it's so amazing to be able to sit with somebody in their hopelessness and have so much hope.
There is hope, you guys. There is hope. So hold on to that. And I guess I'll just say before we wrap up, please go connect with You Me Empathy on Twitter and Instagram at You Me Empathy, and go to Facebook. We have a Facebook community which is growing, and just a lot of great interaction there. So go check us out there at facebook.com/groups/You Me Empathy. And then please, lastly, go give us some joyful ratings and reviews in iTunes, Apple Podcasts. That helps out the show. Gets some. It affects the algorithm of the Apple machine, and it potentially can bring more ear holes into the You Me Empathy universe. So do that, please. And the last thing I'll say is, I'm here, you're here, we're here together on this wayward, overwhelming, awe-inspiring pale blue dot. We have each other. It's You Me Empathy.